Welcome to Right versus Left News, your daily briefing on the stories that matter, told from both sides of the aisle. I'm your AI host, Chris, and each day I bring you the most important political and cultural news, with perspectives from conservative and progressive voices. No spin, no agenda, just the facts and the opinions that shape our national conversation. Let's dive in. Here's what's on deck today. A Justice Department criminal probe into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell bursts into the open. President Trump tells Cuba to make a deal, as Washington moves to choke off Venezuelan oil reaching the island. Europe inches toward the long-delayed EU, Mercosur trade pact, while France's government rides out no-confidence threats. Russia launches another overnight strike on Kyiv, even as the West touts new security guarantees, and the Supreme Court kicks off its January sitting with high-profile arguments that could ripple through energy, sports, and executive power. It's a fast-moving Monday, January 12th. Before we jump into today's stories, a quick word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by Family GPT, the AI chat platform actually designed for kids. If your children are curious about ChatGPT, but you're worried about what they might see, Family GPT gives you full parental controls, content filtering, and the ability to align responses with your family's values, whether Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, and many more. Monitor every conversation, set usage limits, and let your kids explore AI safely. No ads, no data selling, complete privacy. Sign up free at familygpt.chat.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting Right vs. Left News. Now, let's get to the headlines. First up, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell says the Justice Department served the Fed with grand jury subpoenas on Friday and threatened him with a criminal indictment tied to his June 2025 Senate testimony about a $2.5 billion renovation of Federal Reserve buildings. Powell calls the move a political pretext meant to pressure the central bank on interest rates. President Trump denies directing the probe. Markets wobbled on the headlines. On the right, commentators say no official is above the law and a $2.5 billion project merits scrutiny, including potential perjury referrals from House Republicans, while also stressing that DOJ must show independence. Some point to a prior GOP referral alleging Powell misled Congress about cost overruns and amenities, framing this as accountability for stewardship of public institutions, even if the Fed isn't taxpayer-funded. On the left, many outlets and economists call it a frontal assault on Fed independence, an effort to intimidate a central bank that resisted pressure for faster rate cuts. Even some Republicans have criticized the move, fueling worries that politicizing monetary policy could rattle the dollar and bond markets. Investors are on edge. Next, after a U.S. operation that captured Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro, President Trump warns Cuba to make a deal before it is too late, vowing no more oil or money from Caracas to Havana. Cuba's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, fires back that the island is sovereign and blames U.S. sanctions for deepening shortages. On the right, supporters frame the pressure as long overdue leverage against a repressive regime propped up by Venezuelan oil, arguing that cutting the lifeline could force reforms or a wider realignment. They praise a harder line consistent with reversing the Obama-era détente and supporting Cuban dissidents. On the left, critics warn of escalation risks and humanitarian fallout if fuel supplies shrink, blackouts, shortages, and a tougher squeeze on civilians. They note Trump's provocative rhetoric, including amplifying talk about Secretary of State Marco Rubio as president of Cuba, and urge multilateral diplomacy over coercion. Meanwhile, the European Union is moving to finally sign its vast trade agreement with South America's Mercosur bloc after 25 years of talks. Brussels had eyed mid-January for a ceremony in Paraguay, though timelines have slipped before. In France, far-right and far-left parties file no confidence motions over the deal, but the Socialist Party says it won't back them, easing immediate pressure on the government. On the right, pro-trade conservatives and many business voices see strategic upside, diversifying supply chains, securing critical minerals, and countering China's influence. They argue the pact could open markets for European machinery and autos while strengthening ties with Brazil and Argentina. On the left, progressive groups and farm unions warn the deal could undercut European farmers and weaken environmental safeguards, potentially fueling Amazon deforestation. Critics want binding climate and labor conditions before ratification, and they point to farmer protests and skepticism in capitals like Paris. We'll be right back with more of today's news after this brief message.
This episode is brought to you by Family GPT, the AI chat platform actually designed for kids. If your children are curious about ChatGPT, but you're worried about what they might see, Family GPT gives you full parental controls, content filtering, and the ability to align responses with your family's values. Whether Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, and many more. Monitor every conversation, set usage limits, and let your kids explore AI safely. No ads, no data selling, complete privacy. Sign up free at familygpt.chat.
Thanks again to our sponsors. Now back to the news. Overnight in Ukraine, Russia launches an air attack on Kyiv that sparks a district fire as air defenses engage drones and missiles. This comes days after a Paris summit where the US and European partners touted new security guarantees, meant to deter future aggression and to verify any ceasefire. On the right, hawks urge tougher deterrence and faster air defense deliveries to make any peace enforceable. Restraint-minded voices, though, warn against open-ended commitments. One recurring view, strength now can shorten the war. On the left, many back aid tied to accountability and diplomacy, supporting European-style security guarantees but insisting civilian protection and reconstruction financing stay central. Allies are shifting from ad hoc weapons packages toward a longer-term framework aimed at a more durable peace. Finally, the Supreme Court opens its January sitting today. On the docket, a dispute over venue and federal contractor liability arising from Louisiana coastal damage claims. Later this week, cases involving transgender athletes in women's sports. And later this month, arguments tied to executive power and the Federal Reserve. On the right, advocates see a chance to curb forum shopping and rein in litigation they say punishes companies for wartime or federally directed work, while pressing for clearer limits on agency power and for school sports rules based on biological sex. They frame this sitting as part of a broader push for judicial modesty and textualism. On the left, progressives warn that shifting big environmental and climate damage suits to federal court could weaken accountability for oil and gas firms and narrow communities' paths to recover costs. On transgender sports, they argue blanket bans are discriminatory and urge sport-by-sport standards guided by evidence. The potential rulings could ripple far beyond the parties. Quick recap. Powell says DOJ subpoenas threaten Fed independence. Trump ups pressure on Cuba. The EU-Mercosur pact edges closer despite French drama. Russia strikes Kyiv as allies harden security promises. And the Supreme Court returns with cases that could reshape litigation, sports policy, and executive power. We'll be watching what actually gets signed, filed, or argued next. That's it for today's episode of Right versus Left News. Remember, understanding both sides isn't about picking a team, it's about being informed. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join us tomorrow for another balanced look at the day's biggest stories. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.